Welcome to Central Park, one of the most famous parks in the entire world. We're starting right at the only straight path in the entire park, which is called the Mall. But why are we starting by Shakespeare? Well, this was built in the 300th anniversary of his birth in 1864. This was around the time when Central Park was being constructed. Central Park finished construction really in the 1867, and it was one of the largest construction projects in all of New York City history. So let's walk around. And Shakespeare actually has a whole lot of ties with Central Park's history and also how Central Park is today. But why is this the only straight path in the entire park? Well, this park was not designed like the English and French gardens, which were very geometric, straight, and highly manicured. No, when they decided to build this park in the 1850s, they wanted something that felt a little bit more wilder. And thus, these pathways were all winding, crisscrossing, going in directions that were not so obvious in order to provide a more better adventure into nature, even though you're close to the city. Here we have two statues of very famous literary heroes, Sir Walter Scott. He lived from 1771 to 1832, and part of what is called the Mall, quote unquote, it's not for shopping, even though there's a few vendors here. It's called the Mall because traditionally when you have a long pathway filled with greenery, that's the name, it's a mall. And the mall is also known as Literary Walk because of these statues. Now, he is very famous for writing a lot of works that glorified and mythologized Scotland. So our modern version of Scotland and how magical it is because of this guy, Sir Walter Scott. Possibly most famous because of the book History of Scotland back in 1830. And right across, we have this guy. He's also very famous when it comes to New York City history. So, previously I made an episode about New Year's Eve. And New Year's Eve is one of the largest celebrations here in New York City. Countless people gather here, sometimes it's a million plus, in order to sing the countdown, and then a song plays. That song plays is Ong Long Sin. Forgive my pronunciation. And that was written, at least the modern version that we sing today, was written by this guy, Robert Burns. So Robert Burns was a Scottish poet, and a lot of people know him by Rabbie. So next time you sing that New Year's Eve song, it's this guy. So let's continue walking around, and now we're surrounded by all of these huge, massive elms. These are American elms. But these are the most expensive trees in all of the US. Well, why is that? It's just a tree. Why is it so expensive? Well, let's see if we can actually bump into a sign that indicates why it's so expensive. Stay tuned. So a little backstory on Central Park. It was designed by two architects, Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted. But how did they win this contract? Because Frederick Law Olmsted was just a journalist. He had no experience in landscape architecture. And Calvert Vaux, he was more of an architect, at least at first. So how did these guys that were not so experienced end up winning the biggest contract in New York City history? New York City, 1800s, the 40s and the 50s. It was getting extremely crowded, especially below 14th Street. The city needed to expand, and it was going to expand. The grid system was already in place since 1811, and the commissioner's plan created a gridiron across the entire island of Manhattan, but it wasn't quite enough. And that day, in that time, New York City was not Brooklyn and Bronx and Queens and Staten Island. The city of New York was basically just Manhattan and some parts of the Bronx. So it seemed like a small city, and it seemed like soon we were going to be drowned in tenements and factories and docks and piers. So what was New York City to do? We had to build some green space because we had a few major epidemics. Epidemics such as yellow fever, certain outbreaks of cholera, and tuberculosis, and a few others. Many of the people at that time believed that it was due to cramped spaces. Everyone was crammed in. So what could they do? Well, they had to build a park somewhere. But where? There was a few scenarios. They could build a park in a place called Great Jones Wood, which is around the Upper East Side. But this was almost a half a century, a little bit more than a half a century before the New York City subway system was constructed in 1904. Upper East Side was going to be way too far away if you lived below 14th Street. Way too far away. Then New York City thought of another genius plan. Wait a minute. Let's utilize the grand waterfront. Because New York City is surrounded by water, let's use right by it as parkland. Let's make a massive park that rings around. But then they end up realizing, wait a minute, most of our money is coming from the water, from the ports, the piers, the docks, the slips. Basically everything connecting us to the rest of the world and us connecting it to the rest of the US. Wasn't going to be good business to take away that valuable space, especially when factories and manufacturing was starting to be built. We had like a new burgeoning industrial revolution, and thus it enabled the factories to be right next to the water and that to be shipped so you can receive your raw goods and send them out. Again, this was in the early days of the railroad, so we still only have factories far away from the water yet. So no good. We could not sacrifice our industrial might for some beautiful parks. But right in the middle of Manhattan, where we are, was an area. It was very rocky, it was a bit swampy, and wasn't quite the best property. They didn't have quite the highest value, at least on the market. People did live here. There was a village called Seneca Village, and I'll mention that towards the end of our tour. And some people say that there's some great geological secret here that's still kept under the wraps. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But how did a rocky landscape turn into this? Well, the land was cheap and it was fairly flat enough. So New York City gave the go-ahead. And the guys with that plan was our boys, Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. They proposed to build Central Park in the style of the Adirondack Mountains, making it unlike any formal royal park that you would see in the grand cities of Europe. No, they wanted you to feel like you were in the wilderness, in the middle of the mountains of the great US. And thus they took this massive undertaking to carve this landscape completely from scratch in order to make what we have park here today, including some of the most expensive trees in the world, these American elms. Millions of dollars have been spent to maintain these American elms. And here we have the sign that says, "Protect the American elm. Please keep out." Okay, those are very bold words for a tree, you know. We're in the park here. Aren't we supposed to like be next to the trees? Can't we like hug a tree? It shouldn't be that bad. Well, the American elm they planted this in the 1920s. Shortly thereafter, there was a massive disease that started ravaging the American elms across the entire US. It was called Dutch elm disease. The thing is, Dutch elm disease on its own wasn't so bad because it was a fungus, but that fungus was being carried by an invasive species of beetles. So John Lennon wasn't the only beetle that loved Central Park. It was these beetles as well that invaded these trees and destroyed them. But the American elm was America. The American elm was around every single main street in America. It was this country's identity. We cannot sacrifice American elms and replace them with some European breed. So they decided to maintain them at all costs. And to this day, they're still vulnerable to that beetle, not John Lennon, the actual beetle, and to Dutch elm disease. And hence they spend millions of dollars to maintain all these trees. And they're looking mighty healthy, and they have proved to be an iconic spot for countless films, such as When Harry Met Sally, and countless Instagrams that you'll see all around, especially during fall time when the leaves start turning. Let's continue walking through. I want to show you quite a bit of Central Park, so I'm going to walk a little bit faster than I usually would on a tour or kind of strolling about, because I want to show you a little bit more of the park in a single 30-40 minute video. So let's go. Here usually there's skateboarders, there's like people rollerblading. Today's a little bit quieter, this area. Here's one of the band shells, and right behind the band shell we actually have the summer stage, which we can't really see it from this angle. Lots of concerts started here, and then they started playing it right behind it. Beautiful day. We hear the birds chirping. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood today, just like Mr. Rogers said. It's a long day walking through Central Park, and especially if you're a tourist and you're not so used to the city, you probably didn't come prepared, and you probably didn't eat beforehand. And then you're suddenly very hungry and you're like, oh my God, I need some food. Well, a lot of people gravitate to the most stereotypical food to have in all of New York City. That food is the hot dog. Thing is, this hot dog stand right over here is one of the most expensive stands in all of New York. You buy here a hot dog maybe for $3 or $4. You might think to yourself, maybe, if you're a savvy New Yorker, you might think to yourself, I'm being ripped off. But the guys who own these stands are paying upwards of $200,000 to $289,000 for this stand. Yep, $200,000 to maintain and own the permit for this hot dog stand. But why? Why do they need to spend so much? And are they making that money back? Well, fortunately in the pandemic, it might be a different case. But beforehand, they were. Because this is a very big hot spot for buying hot dogs. Many hungry tourists come over here. But why is it so expensive to own a stand of hot dogs in the middle of a park? If you go to other parks around the world, they're surrounded by stands. But New York City wanted to limit that. So they limited the stands to only 3,100. That is the max number. There's no more stands than that. Any other stands are illegal. So permits are in high demand. Some permits are very low. The lowest one in the entire island of Manhattan is all the way in Inwood Park, which is all the way up north, a little bit further up north than where the movie In the Heights takes place. And that only costs $700 a year. Not too much. But this, on the other hand, is an extremely high demand. More than $200,000 a year. So next time you pay $4 for that hot dog, remember how much this guy is paying. Here we have Bethesda Terrace, and soon we're going to go down to the arcade. But there's one specific little secret right below us. And let me wait until people over here pass through. All right. So here we have two columns. Now, one of the architects, Frederick Law Olmsted, was mostly the landscape architect. As I mentioned, he never actually designed any landscape architecture before, but somehow he got the job, not having too much experience. Goes to show you don't always need experience to get a job. Sometimes all you need is a good vision. And then, Calvert Vaux built most of the structures, along with designing the park with Olmsted. He also designed the structures. And part of the design process for the structures was to integrate them into the actual landscape. But as I mentioned, this entire landscape is made from scratch. None of this is real. Central Park is a lie. It's a huge lie. All right, I'm teasing. It's a bit harsh words. It's not a lie, but it's all designed from scratch. So keep that in mind. Including the architecture was implemented into these rolling hills and these winding pathways. Right here we have sculptures, and they decided to hire one of the more famous sculptors at that time, or relief makers. His name was Jacob Ray Mould. So Jacob Ray Mould molded these amazing little sculptures. And this is the summer theme. So here we have a bright sunrise, we have the rooster cock-a-doodling in the morning. This is daytime, actually. Might have said summer by mistake. Daytime. And here we have a daytime scene. But on the other side, we have night. And this one, we have someone reading some religious text under candlelight, or maybe just another book. We have an owl, an imagery that you see all around New York City. We also have a bat right over here, but you have to go around this corner and you'll see a witch. Now, this is nothing out of the ordinary for 2021 or for the past maybe 80 or so years, because Halloween is an extremely popular holiday. But back in 1850s, not that many people actually knew about Halloween. The people who did know about Halloween were the people who built this park. So here we have a witch flying on her broomstick, and we have a little pumpkin and a little moon right behind it. So the people who built this park were mostly Irish Americans. In the 1840s and the 1850s, especially after the Great Irish Famine, which is a very complicated affair, and that's the name that we use to just, that is most well known by it, but it's much more complicated than just being a famine. Nonetheless, millions of Irish people came over here. To a point in the mid-1800s, 1 in every 4 New Yorkers were Irish. And thus, many of them were hired here because they were extremely cheap labor. Jacob Ray Mould maybe was paying tribute to the Irish over here, because the Irish are the ones who brought over Halloween. That's why we celebrate here in America. It's because of the Irish Americans. Some people might be saying that he's paying tribute to them. Some people might be saying that he's maybe making fun of them. Maybe it's a little bit of both. So who knows what this molding by Jacob Ray Mould was intended for? What do you think? Let me know. Let's go down to one of the most photographed places in all of Central Park. This is known for countless engagement photos, countless wedding photos, basically anything to celebrate graduation. Anything right here is countless times it's taken. So this looks epic. Usually this is wide open. There's usually someone playing an instrument right here in the middle. It's a popular place for buskers, street musicians. But today they seem to have a dinner. This is an epic place to have a dinner. I'm gonna see if I can crash it a little bit later. Over here we have these beautiful murals. In order to make it look a little bit more decorative, it's a European tradition of making murals that look like actual architectural design reliefs. But here, in this case, just like in most cases in New York City, you gotta look up. This is the only example of Victorian era tiling on a ceiling. It's a marvelous display that unfortunately was covered in tar and rust for many, many decades throughout the 1900s because traffic used to run right above our heads. But luckily it was restored in the early 2000s to its original glory. These are called Minton tiles. There's two main designs, which you see over here, and it has 49 panels with all the panels in a total of 15,876 tiles. It was originally made in the 1860s. So you can see why this is such a popular hotspot. And lots of Instagrams. And dinner a little bit later today. Is this a wedding? Oh, there's a Central Park fundraising event. So if you got the funds, you're gonna have the fun. Amazing. So 1970s was a terrible decade for New York City, but especially a terrible decade for Central Park. For many decades already, it was already an abandoned place. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, Central Park was actually used as a shanty town. And then in the 70s, it was abandoned. It was a crime-ridden place, including here, Bethesda Terrace. It was looking dry, no beautiful grass, the graffiti all around the terrace itself, and there was car traffic passing all the time above. Not quite a pleasant place, but luckily Central Park Conservancy, which is a nonprofit, it raises all of its funds from private investors, maintains this park. This is one of its centerpieces. This is the Angel in the Waters, made by the only female sculptor to be featured in Central Park, one of the first major female sculptors to be featured in New York City outdoors, period. Emma Stebbins. She molded this in Munich. And of course, it's iconic. It's iconic in the amazing play, Angels in the Water, same name. And also people say it's an inspiration for the beginning of the TV show Friends. This and the Bethesda Fountain in Plaza Hotel. See how gorgeous it is. And we get to see more of the skinny skyscrapers of New York City. Beautiful, beautiful day here today. So here we have the beautiful pond, the beautiful lake of Central Park. Well known for rowboating, which I highly recommend doing if you're here. And right down there is the Low Boathouse. That's the place where, in the film When Harry Met Sally, Sally was brunching with her friends and she comes to a realization that she might have an actual crush on Billy Crystal's character. But down here we have the main attraction for a lot of people, the turtles. Remember when I mentioned that the beetle that ravaged the American elm was an invasive species? Well, these guys are as well. They are not indigenous to New York. There's indigenous turtles here for sure, but they're not these ones. These turtles were all the rage as pets. The thing is, they were illegal to have as a pet for one very good reason. So why were they illegal to have as pets? Right behind it we have another pond called Turtle Pond, and it's named after these turtles. Well, these turtles look so tiny when they're little. And they used to be sold in Chinatown. Chinatown was the main place where you can buy them. The thing is with these turtles, they start this tiny. So sometimes kids, or a lot of the times, kids would buy them and then they'd be like, hey mom, I want a tiny little turtle. And the parents, not knowing too much about turtles or how they grow, they were like, sure, we'll buy a turtle. At first they only need a tank that's maybe like 2 or 3 times bigger than that tiny little turtle. The thing is, a few months after, they grow. And then you'll need a tank that's even bigger because you can't use the same tank, because if you do, that turtle will die on you. But then they grow even more, and you're gonna need even more tanks. And then they grow even more, and then you're gonna need a gigantic tank that costs way too expensive. So a lot of these parents started freeing the turtles in order to not let them die by not giving them a big enough tank. They decided to free them here at the lake, here in Central Park. Be free, turtle. The thing is, fortunately, they are an invasive species. And yes, you can still find them sometimes illegally, but no, I would not recommend them buying them. We can see people rowboating. So Central Park is known for its bridges. There's 35 unique bridges here, each with their individual style and building material. This bridge is particularly special, not because of its aesthetic beauty, but also because it is the first cast iron bridge in New York. Cast iron ended up revolutionizing certain neighborhoods in New York City, such as Soho, which is one of the largest cast iron districts in the world. Cast iron makes it very easy to build very ornate architecture by spending very little money. Beautiful. All right, so Central Park is very nice and beautiful, and you know, it's easy to find your way around. You can see the buildings. You might have Google Maps with you. But now we're going to a part of Central Park called the Ramble. And the Ramble is the wildest part of Central Park. It's really meant for you to get lost in. And for good reason. This place, you really do feel immersed into the park. But fret not, there's a built-in navigation system into the park itself. And here's one of the more beautiful views, one of the iconic buildings. Oh, look at that. Wow. Amazing. So Frederick Olmsted wanted this to truly feel like the Adirondacks and the Appalachian Mountains. But as I mentioned, for most of Central Park's history, there was no such thing as Google Maps. So how in the world would you find your way back here in the 1870s in the middle of Central Park when it's super dark at night? How would you find your way? Well, there's a built-in navigation system. No, you did not need to carry an actual map. There was no tourist kiosks back then where they would give you a paper map. No, you would have to go to the light posts. And in these light posts, we have these numbers. 7417. 74, the two first numbers, the 2 to 3 first numbers are the street. 74 means that we are aligned with 74th Street. Right over here, the 74th Street. And 7, when they are odd numbers, mean that we are closer west. So we're more west. So we're closer to Upper West Side at 74th Street, while the even numbers are more east. That's how you can find your way around Central Park back then, before the age of Google Maps. Now, one thing that is real about this park, a lot of things here are fake, you know. As I mentioned, Central Park is a lie. But one thing that isn't a lie is this big pile of schist. Schist. Get schist. Don't mispronounce that word. It's very close to another word. Big pile of schist. Right here. This is Manhattan schist, to be specific. And it is bedrock. It is the bedrock that is enabled New York City to build gigantic skyscrapers. It's because of this pile of schist. Not this specific one, but just in general, the pile of schist all underneath our feet. It's because we have skyscrapers. But these are real. These are natural to the landscape. As I mentioned, Central Park was very rocky before. So we're running a little bit tight on time. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna teleport to 2 different locations. So I hope you enjoy. Let's go. We have our next stop. It looks like a big pile of schist, but it's a little bit more than a pile of schist. A cave that was used back in Native American times. The Lenape Native Americans are who were here before the Dutch, and then after the British, and then us Americans and many other people coming from all around the world. They used this cave. But the thing is, this cave was sealed. And not because of some Native American secrets or some type of dark magic, no. It's because back in the 1920s and 30s, this cave was a point where criminals can take their tiny little rowboats, as we saw people beautifully rowboating around this gorgeous day. But back then, at night, it would be a criminal coming here to do illicit activities. I won't describe what those activities were, but it was such a big nuisance that the city had to do something about it. And thus they sealed up the cave right here, right below our feet, where we can't really see it to this day. Though there is a path that some people at their own risk do try to sneak in and get a little bit closer, but I recommend against it, as evidenced by that rag that we see right there. So now let's go to our final stop, the castle in the middle of Central Park. Yep, there's a literal castle in the middle of Central Park. I'm not joking with you, and it is not a pile of schist. It's a real castle. Let's go. 1895. One of the co-architects, Calvert Vaux, who designed these beautiful buildings and this castle that we're about to approach, was taking one of his long walks all the way down to the very southern tip of Brooklyn. He was already in very late age, and he loved walking his entire life. That walk would be a few miles long. But this day, he was writing a letter. And in this letter, according to legend, we knew that he wrote something, but we don't know what. And according to legend, he mentioned that Central Park had a very big secret. A secret that cannot be exposed until 1965. That's legend. But what actually happened according to history? Well, he goes down to Gravesend, to right by the Atlantic Ocean, where you can see the sea. And he talks to a captain, a sea captain, who he's friends with. And he's admiring the new construction of the port this captain made. And many hours later, Calvert Vaux was found dead, washed up ashore. His glasses missing, one shoe also missing. The only thing that they found on his person, aside from his clothes, was his pocket watch and about $2 in change. But as they were investigating the death, his son immediately said, no, it wasn't suicide. Not at all. And the investigators also took murder out of the question. No, couldn't quite be that. But how exactly he died, no one knows for sure. Some people think that he passed away while admiring the new dock of this captain friend of his, and that he might have slept and fell. Maybe he bumped his head. Maybe he had a heart attack and he drowned. No one knows for sure. But then in 2006, a man called David Wise alleged that he found this so-called papers, this last letter of Calvert Vaux that he wrote. He said that he received it from a woman, and that this woman ended up mysteriously dying a few months after he received these letters. And the contents of these letters would shock him. Let's see our final stop, which is here, the castle, right in the middle of Central Park. This is Belvedere Castle. It's known as a folly. The reason it's known as a folly is because follies are meant to look magical and whimsical when they're not really that practical. And yeah, we actually need a castle. There's nothing here to protect. No one's living in this castle, but we built it to make it look magical and whimsical. Hence, it was called a folly. This also is very important because anytime you pull up the weather and it says New York City weather and it says the weather in Central Park, it's actually right over here. Let me show it to you. So right up there is the weather vane, and that weather vane is what calculates the weather when you search up the weather of New York City. And here is Turtle Pond, where most people dumped their turtles or freed their turtles when they had them as pets initially, and then they started invading the rest of Central Park. And I'll show you one last thing before we get to the mystery of Calvert Vaux. Right down there, you see right over here, the stage is where Shakespeare in the Park takes place. Started by a man called Joseph Papp back in the 60s, who wanted to bring Shakespeare to the masses, and for free. And thus, the tradition of having Shakespeare in the Park started. So back to Calvert Vaux. What happened to him? What is this guy, David Wise, saying that there's these letters? Well, in these letters, he alleged, and this is legend. No one knows if this is sure for truth. Maybe it's one big lie. Who knows? But it's a fun story. I want to tell it to you. David Wise says that in these letters, he wrote of a grand secret, a big secret that cannot be revealed until the year 1965. Calvert Vaux allegedly wrote this in 1895. The other thing is, if you decode the secret that is written within these letters, because there was a coded message in them, that you had to use a key in order to decipher. If you found out this secret, you had to keep it to yourself for at least 10 years. This woman, so-called woman, that handed these letters to David Wise, who is a real person, by the way, said that the woman died because she revealed the secret too soon to him. And he is not revealing the secret to anyone, but he is giving these papers to anyone who wants them. So what is the gigantic secret hiding behind Central Park? Maybe it's a complete fallacy. Most likely is. But nonetheless, it is a park with a lot of cool things to see. So I hope Calvert Vaux rests in peace. He did definitely live a long life despite his tragic end. And Frederick Law Olmsted, along with his sons, end up making hundreds of parks around the US. People say that he made up to 700 parks under him and his company's name. So this park ended up inspiring parks all around the US and also the world. Thank you everyone so much for watching this grand tour of Central Park. And as I like to say in my own show, keep being awesome and always keep on exploring. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.